Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the NAACP BET Unmasked COVID Virtual Town Hall Series. This is our last episode for the month, and today we're talking with local leaders, governors, mayors, congressional leaders about the federal response and local response. We have an excellent panel for you today. If at any time you have a question, please dial *3. It will get you in the question queue. It won't interrupt the program, but will get you in the queue so you can ask your question. And if you want to support the NAACP and the Town Hall program, please dial *8 for a one-time text to support the program. With that, I will turn it over to NAACP President and CEO, President Derek Johnson, for some opening remarks. President Johnson, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Abba. And I want to thank all of our guests today for joining us. This has been an exciting opportunity for the NAACP to share critical information during this pandemic crisis. For the NAACP, it is our job to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, provide timely information as we navigate through this moment. As many of you have watched the news over the last 2 weeks, we have begun to see the disproportionality of those who have been impacted by COVID-19. And we have also seen individuals, policymakers, leaders across this country stand up to the challenge, while we've seen other policy leaders reverse course and create an environment that could be even more dangerous for the American public as we know it. But we are pleased to bring on as our host, our friend, one of our most outstanding members, the voice for Black America at the White House, Ms. April Ryan. April, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, President Johnson. Thank you so much for having me. This is a very serious time, and it's an honor to be part of this very serious conversation about COVID-19 and the coronavirus. I bring greetings to you from the American Urban Radio Networks and as the White House correspondent and as political analyst for CNN. And we want to go straight into this because of the urgency of the matter and the hour. We want to start with U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar. She is here with us tonight to discuss various issues. And first, I want to bring her in. Welcome, Senator Klobuchar. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Doing your incredible job, like so many journalists, in some really tough times. If you weren't speaking truth to power at the White House, all we'd see was power, and power that's, as we know, being abused. So I really appreciate your willingness to question, despite however the president treats you every single day. And I want to also thank Derek, by the way, Derek for his leadership at the NAACP, generations of leadership. And just maybe quickly before April and I talk, filling you in on the work that we're doing. We had a proposal from the Republicans in the Senate that would have just basically been more of the same when it came to the small business program. We fought really hard and stood our ground, worked with Speaker Pelosi and the Congressional Black Caucus, and we were able to change that small business program going forward to make sure that $60 billion was set aside for small lenders that serve minority communities, women-owned business, and the like. We'd still like to see more changes, but that's one major thing that was changed. We also fought for our frontline workers. And I will say that while people are cheering our healthcare workers and those that are on the front line every day, some who aren't getting cheered, like grocery store people and clerks and people who are janitors at our hospitals, maybe the people that you don't see all the time, that cheering has to come with changes in policies. And I just don't think of this racial disparity issue as something we're looking at right now. Actually, it's putting in glaring focus the racial disparities that the NAACP has been pointing out for generations. When you look at the numbers right now, African Americans count for 70% of the deaths, but 30% of the population in Louisiana during this pandemic. Alabama, 44% of the deaths, but 26% of the population. And so far, we only have the racial data that so many of us have been calling for 26 states. And I personally asked the president on a call, literally asked him when we were going to get that data. And he told us about a week or so ago that we'd have it in a week and a half to 2 weeks. So I am continuing to push, as there's so many others in your leadership at the NAACP. The other things about this is to make sure that we see this as the immediate need for testing, the immediate need for making sure that we're getting the money to our city and state governments. I know you're going to hear that from our local leaders, that the Republicans resisted in this last vote, that we have to do in the next package, but then it's beyond. We have to take the lessons that's been learned from this pandemic, the hard, horrible lessons of the people that were not protected, didn't have the right gear, didn't have childcare, didn't have family leave, and make sure we change our policies going forward. And the one last thing I want to say before April and I talk and I take some questions is this very voting itself, our democracy. And I've been working on democracy issues for a while as the ranking member on the Senate Rules Committee, and I've never seen anything like what we saw in Wisconsin. We literally had people, because they believe so much in our democracy, in Milwaukee, in garbage bags and homemade masks, some of them having just gotten off work, in line in the rain. We now know that over a dozen of them got sick, including a poll worker. At the same time, we have a president of the United States in the comfort of his own home at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue that was able to request a mail-in ballot from Palm Beach, Florida, and was able to vote from the comfort of his own home, probably in his slippers. I made that up, but that's what I picture. And so you have people all over the country that want to be able to vote, and they shouldn't have to risk their lives to do it. So my focus right now is getting the voting provisions into this next package. And that means significant funding so we can get mail-in ballots and allow people to vote from home, breaking down the barriers that require in 6 states, ready for this, a notary or 2 witnesses. That's Alabama and 5 other states. So let's say you were sick and you're in the hospital, you'd have to get a notary to get your ballot. So those are some of the things we want to break down, as well as, because not everyone's going to vote by mail. We have some states that are only at 5% by that. Getting our polling locations open for 20 days, giving states adequate funding so they can maintain those polling locations so that people don't all vote at once. And then on election day, training poll workers, a new generation of poll workers, so we can have people, in addition to our senior population that have really had the weight on their shoulders, being able to man those polling locations so we don't have it just vulnerable people at the locations. So these are civil rights issues for all of America. And again, I think what we've seen during this pandemic is what we have seen and the NAACP has seen throughout our history. It's just bringing it in more glaring focus, and look forward to having a discussion. And thank you so much for having me.
Senator Klobuchar, thank you so much. We have time for one question of you, and I'm going to throw a lot in that one question. Power means service. And right now, service is needed on various issues. And I'm talking about the urgency of now, the issue of the health disparity. You said something about President Trump still has yet to give the information, the data on the racial disparity as to those who are contracting and dying from COVID-19. Also, I want to ask you about the PPPs. There are small businesses, small minority businesses who are in dire need of this money. What is exactly happening now? What are you able to ensure will happen as it relates to this health disparity issue and as it relates to small businesses getting their money in this next wave?
Well, a lot of this will be putting this into law if they haven't come up with the data, and even if they have temporarily, we can't trust them to keep doing it. So it's putting it into law and making this a major priority that we get the data. Data sometimes can sound hollow to people who are fighting for their lives, but we have to have it to make the case to get the resources. It's kind of like just getting the census data. We have to get that data so that we have the power to get the resources where they need to go. The second piece about this is the small business program, which of course had good intentions, but we don't run the Senate and the Democratic Party. I can tell you we want to big time after this election, and we want a new president. But right now, we made some immediate changes to the program because we said we're not going to give any more money for it until we make sure that money it goes in two different ways. One is part of that program that there's set asides for the small businesses. We've learned that some of these banks have pre-existing relationships with a lot of major companies that have branches and things, and that's where the money went. And we want to make sure it goes to small lenders that specifically serve the minority and the African American communities. The other piece of it is some more emergency loans that are set aside just for this purpose, and they're not even loans, they're grants. So you don't have to pay them back. And we have to make sure that happens as well. What I've seen in my neighborhood, I live in the city, is what so many people have seen, and that is boarded up storefronts. And those are people's dreams and hopes, our barbers, our hairdressers, our manicure businesses. And one other thing I just want to add is in rural areas, and sometimes people don't always think about this, that 1 of 5 rural residents are people of color. Look at those high numbers out of Albany, Georgia, where they had this hot spot, and sadly we lost lives. That was in an African American community. So making sure that we at the same time are seeing this and not letting the president tell people in rural America, oh, you're fine, it's no problem. We have to be a strong voice to say, follow the science, and make sure that they get the resources too.
Senator Klobuchar, thank you so much for your time, and we
thank
hope
you,
your
April.
husband is feeling better.
Yeah.
He is now, from your words, he is now healed. He is now recovered from COVID-19, correct?
He is, and I saw firsthand, I could never hug those healthcare workers that took care of him in the hospital because of the rules, and they had to hold the phone up to his ear. He was very low on oxygen. He had severe pneumonia. He was coughing up blood, and he took a turn for the better. Well, so many, like my friend Keith Ellison in Minnesota, his mom, she was an amazing woman, social worker until a few weeks before her death. They didn't even know till after she died, the test hadn't come back saying she had the virus. And so there are so many people that are in the hospital right now, and you want to be with them and you can't. So I learned that from there, but we're so happy he's home and he's been able to give his plasma to help other people. And he's back pretty much 100%. As I said to you earlier, April, the only remaining symptom seems to be that he doesn't want to clean the basement because he claims this will somehow trigger his symptoms. I think it may be a story, but I just got to go with it. So
I'll use that as a story.
I hope I can see you all soon. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Senator Klobuchar. Now we're going to go directly to someone who is in New Orleans. You may know his name and his voice. He is actor Wendell Pierce, who is in the area that Senator Klobuchar said is seeing 70% of deaths that are Black America in New Orleans. Wendell, hello. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, April. I really appreciate it. The NAACP for generations has been, a leader in advocacy, and I join you tonight to kind of really tackle some of these issues head on and come up with some solutions and point out where people are complicit.
Please give us the lay of the land. You said something so poignant earlier about not recovering from Katrina as far as healthcare and hospitals, and how can you adequately treat a community that is disproportionately affected by this disease when the hospital system and the healthcare system is not where it was pre-Katrina?
Yes, here in New Orleans especially is a place where lessons can be learned from the tragedy of what Katrina was and the tragedy of what post-Katrina still is. You can go into areas of our city in New Orleans in the lower Ninth Ward, and it's as if Katrina happened yesterday. And what we have to realize is that there was a pandemic of poverty and racism long before there was a pandemic of COVID-19. And that's what we're seeing, the glaring illumination of that. We are all aware of the president's negligence and his complicity of calling it a hoax, dismantling the pandemic response team with the NSA, the delay of the Defense Production Act. But we have to realize that the Trump administration is in courts right now in the middle of this pandemic, fighting to end Obamacare with no alternative in its place. To me, that's just immoral to actually be taking away any sort of health care from people at the height of one of our greatest public health crisis in our lifetime. But here in New Orleans, we lost 100,000 African Americans that were displaced after Katrina. Why? Because during the recovery, the one thing that happened that was, to me, criminal was all public housing was demolished. All public housing was demolished post-Katrina. You would think that in recovery, you would want to bring back housing to make sure people had access to housing. But all public housing was demolished, and only a third of it was brought back. And
so do you believe that is do you believe that that's the reason why the hospitals have gotten smaller? It's not as many beds, and now they also have to use the convention center as well to make up for those beds, plus just to accommodate the numbers that they're expecting from the deaths or from those who've contracted coronavirus?
No, that contributed to the poverty that is continually going on. And then under the administration of Governor Jindal, he didn't accept Medicaid. But at the same time, we're looking at 2/3 of this city that had access to the hospital that I'm nearest to, which was Methodist Hospital, now New Orleans East Hospital. I'm in a historic African-American neighborhood of Pontchartrain Park. And when my mother was ill during this time, she had to go across the city to get any health care before her death. And we know that this hospital, it took a decade for it to be reestablished. And then it came back with only half the beds that were there previously. So monies that were given to the city so that we can reconstitute our healthcare system were not used in a way that they can reconstitute it. And so we're suffering from that now. The disparity in healthcare is because of the disparity of access to healthcare, the disparity of, it's tied in with the disparity of public housing and access to decent housing and healthcare, which is going to have an impact on the economy and whether or not people can actually survive and afford healthcare so that they can protect their health. But this is an equal opportunity example of negligence. I'm not going to bite my tongue. Right there in New York, I also live in New York. As an actor, I go back and forth. At the height of this pandemic in April, Governor Cuomo put out a budget that cut Medicaid, actually closed public health facilities in New York. But the press isn't focusing on that. We're looking at the outer boroughs of Bronx, of the Queens, of Brooklyn, of those hospitals, and in the historic African-American community of Harlem, the Harlem Hospital. That's where you're seeing the lack of resources, the disparity of health care for the working poor, the poor, and people of color being exacerbated. But yet you look at the other richer hospitals right in Manhattan, Mount Sinai, St. Vincent's, Roosevelt, Columbian Presbyterian. You don't see that. You don't see those issues there. And so it's just a glaring example that there was a pandemic in our communities of poverty and racism that denied people access to decent health care. And now the story is being told that our communities, well, it was our behavior that's the cause of us having so many underlying conditions, and therefore that's the cause of the disparity in the numbers of seeing more deaths in our communities. But that's not true. We're talking about a systematic undercutting of the access to health care that any other community saddled with that disparity would have the same results.
Wendell, we appreciate you so much for your time and giving us the lay of the land on the ground in New Orleans as you're sheltering with your father there. Thank you so much for joining us. And now we're going to go to one of the people that you just mentioned. We're going to go to Governor Andrew Cuomo, the governor of the state of New York.
Thank you very much, April, and good evening to all of you. Thank you for joining this virtual meeting. I hope today finds you and your loved ones healthy and safe. I want to thank Derek Johnson and the entire NAACP team for putting together this program and for inviting me to join. My second mother, Hazel Dukes, who was still trying to teach me right from wrong. And I want to thank all of you at home for what you've done, for the sacrifices that you've made, the challenges that you've endured on behalf of Americans. The African American community has shouldered an unbelievable burden throughout this crisis. The people on the front lines of this fight are often African American. The healthcare worker, the firefighter, the bus driver, the grocery store clerk who gets up every morning and goes out, all these people who work so hard so others can stay home and be safe. And while they're doing this, they're simultaneously bearing the brunt of the virus. The same community that has to go to work every morning to help our country get through another day is the same community that's more likely to have an underlying health condition, like diabetes or asthma, that leaves them especially susceptible. It's the same community that's likely living in the densest part of town, that's living in the densest housing. It's the same community that doesn't have the same access to health care and emergency services that other communities do. So it's an act of unimaginable courage, toughness, and love. It's the reason this nation is successful in flattening the curve and getting through this difficult time. So first of all, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you from New York, which has been the hardest hit place with this coronavirus. But let's also use this moment and this situation to expose the chronic injustice and to resolve it. That's what we're working to do in New York. We've launched an effort with the State University at Albany and Northwell Health to do just that, to document the facts, document the infection rate, the health inequities, the poor services, and the percent of the essential workers who are members of the African American community. Let's reveal the facts, and then let's make the changes to this state and the country that have been long in coming. Let's use this as a pivot moment to actually show and expose the injustice and show what needs to be done. All challenges, from the Great Depression to 9/11 to hurricanes like Hurricane Andrew and Katrina to Superstorm Sandy, there's an opportunity to change and to grow if we seize it. And this is a moment to seize. Since it was founded here in New York, 1909, the NAACP has always used its voice to demand that, especially in moments like this, to demand the principles of fairness and resilience and progress. That's what makes this society work, and the evolution of those changes and the progress that we make so people see that we're actually getting better and improving. New York State is the most progressive state in the nation. That is our legacy. And it's a legacy that is very, very important to me and that I am very aggressive in pursuing. We lead by example, not with words. We make progressive change a reality in New York State. And then we stand up and say to the rest of the nation, why don't you follow? This is a moment to bring true justice, economic justice, social justice, racial justice to this state and nation. That must be the silver lining to this storm. And together, New York and the NAACP, we must make it so. We will. Thank you, stay safe, and God bless you.
Thank you, Governor Cuomo. Now we're going to travel south. We're going to travel to Atlanta, Georgia, to Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, the mayor of that city that is in the midst of news as the state of Georgia is open. And the mayor has asked people to stay at home. Welcome, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms.
So, April, for the past few days, I have been resting on the words of Audre Lorde, your silence will not protect you. In Georgia, we have seen our governor open up our state, despite the fact that our numbers are continuing to rise, despite the fact that our diabetes, high blood pressure, asthma, heart disease rates are higher than the national average, despite the fact that in Albany, Georgia, the rates per capita are similar to those seen in New York. We know on the front line, on every corner, in the African American community in particular, there are barbershops and hair salons. These are our frontline workers who will go into these places of business and then possibly take COVID 19 back into their homes, where African Americans are more challenged when faced with this illness. And so this is a crisis in Atlanta, and it's a crisis throughout our state. And although, as mayor of Atlanta, I don't have the authority to supersede what the governor has put in place, I've repeatedly said over the course of the past week that I still have the authority of my voice. And I'm continuing to use that to encourage people to stay home. And what we are seeing is that the vast majority of Georgians agree. There was a poll that was released today, and the vast majorities of Georgians say that they disagree with the governor's orders. And so I just ask people to continue to help those who are feeling compelled to choose between going to work and staying at home. It's the reason we are delivering meals to our seniors and to our students. We've started a beauty and barbershop relief fund in Atlanta. We also have a small business loan fund, creative industry fund, and so much of this is going to rely on the goodwill of people across this country to allow us to get to the other side of this.
The other side, this is not going to be a short haul. This is a long haul. The other side, I've talked to various people, to include former National Security Advisor and former U.S. Ambassador Susan Rice, and former Homeland Security head Jay Johnson, who said that this is going to be at least 2 years. One, with the find of a vaccination; two, mass production of a vaccination; three, with the global immunization of this said vaccine. How do you intend to keep the numbers down as people are wanting to leave their homes, as the governor of Georgia is saying, go out in this 2 year span?
Well, April, again, it's going to be about us stepping up as leaders and making it possible for people to stay at home. We have to find a way to get laptops into the homes of people, to extend Wi-Fi into all of our communities so that people can transition into working from home. I'll give the example of our 311 operators in the city of Atlanta. They normally come into downtown Atlanta and work from a facility right next to our police headquarters. Well, we've now figured out that if we put laptops in their hands, that they can now work from home. And granted, everyone won't have the ability to do that. But again, as leaders, it's our responsibility for people who can't work from home that we make it easier for them to stay at home. We make sure that they have food on the table. We do things like we've done in Atlanta. We suspend the payment of water bills. We suspend parking ticket fines and things like that. That for people who are already living on the margins economically, these things can set them back even more. And I think we've got to be creative. This is, I've heard someone say, don't call it the new normal, call it the now normal. This is our now normal. And the reality is that it may be our now normal for the next 2 years. But I believe as the United States of America, we've certainly faced challenges before, and certainly African Americans have faced generational challenges that we've been able to get to the other side of this. But I think it's going to require that we all have the will to make sure that our communities, all of our communities, get to the other side of this.
So, where is the outcry coming from? Is it coming from those who are hourly wage workers, or people who just are tired of being home? Where's this outcry to leave the home, to follow the orders, to go out to the salons or bowling or wherever? Who are the persons who want to leave?
So, April, I saw a great quote from Whitney Young today, and he said, "The hardest work in the world is being out of work." So, I think that there's a segment of the population who has to go to work. They need to put food on their table, and they don't have a savings account. That's one segment. And then I think there is another segment, I'll call just a very selfish segment, that's simply tired of being in the house and they are making the decision to go out and go bowling and to go to movie theaters and do these things of luxury that is quite frankly absurd to do in the midst of a pandemic. And what people have to understand, and I'm sure so many who are watching understand this, it's not your choice whether or not simply whether or not you go out. Because if you go out and then you are infected, you may be asymptomatic, but you're taking it into the grocery store with you, to the person who's stocking the shelves in the grocery store and doesn't have a savings in case they get sick, or may not have the same immune system that you have. And in the same way, that we have seen countries across the globe flatten this curve by simply staying at home. The way we are seeing it happen in New York, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here in Georgia and any other number of the southern states and states across this country that are opening back up too soon.
So, Madam Mayor, you said that you're seeing spikes again. With that said, understanding that there's 5 to 12 days between being introduced to the germ, the virus, this lethal, invisible virus, that people get sick. Are you expecting that in this time frame now that people are moving about?
April, if we listen to what the science has shown us, then I think we have to expect it. And I'm an optimist. So I am hopeful it doesn't happen. I've never wanted to be more wrong in my entire life than I feel about this. But when I listen to the head of Grady Hospital, the largest trauma center in southeastern United States, our major hospital in our city, say that just over the last 3 days, he has seen the highest numbers that he has seen in the midst of this pandemic. And now we are opening up Lenox Square Mall and Phipps Plaza and all of these other places where people leisurely congregate. I have to expect that over the next week to 14 days, our numbers will go up even higher. Just today, between noon and 6 o'clock, we had 15 people die in the state. Our numbers are not flattening, and it defies logic that we are proceeding on this path to what could be a catastrophic outcome for the people of Georgia.
My last question to you, Madam Mayor. I'm a White House correspondent, and I've seen you tackle the governor of Georgia. But the president is the commander in chief. He took an oath to protect and serve. If you had a chance to talk to the president, and I don't know if you've talked to him as of yet, have you? First of all, have you talked to him during this
I have
pandemic?
not spoken. No.
Right now, with this platform, what would you say to the president in the midst of this pandemic and seeing the numbers that you see climb and being the mayor of this major metropolitan economic generating city?
What I would say is that leadership requires courage, and it means that you will have to make tough decisions. In the same way tough decisions were made when this country has entered war, in the same way tough decisions have been made when we face economic crises, and the same that tough decisions have been made when we face terrorism. This is a war that we are facing with an enemy that's attacking us across the globe. And as Americans and as president, I would ask that you face this battle in the same way that so many other presidents have done before. It's with courage, it should be with compassion, and it should be with the expectation that there are better days to come, but it will require that tough decisions be made today so that our tomorrows will be better than our yesterday.
Madam Mayor, I thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you so much, and we
Thank
wish you
you.
the best.
Thank you.
Up next, we have the governor of the state of Michigan, Governor Gretchen Whitmer. Governor Whitmer, thank you so much for joining us this evening for this all important town hall panel discussion. Governor Whitmer, first of all, what are your thoughts on this matter as we are trying to figure out, do we stay in or do we leave for economic sake?
Glad to be with you and appreciate the work of this critical organization. I think that, I was so glad to hear the mayor talking moments ago, because I have a lot of friends and who live in Georgia who know that she's the voice of reason, and lives are at stake. In Michigan, our experience with COVID-19 was it was dramatic, and it increased so quickly. And to this date, we've lost 3,567 souls. And I share that number because we always update people, but we never take enough time, I think, to recognize that those are people whose stories will never be fully told, who left left family behind, left lives, had stories. I think that it's really important for us to remember what's really at stake here. As the conversation heats up across our country around the economy, and that's an important conversation, we can't move and not address the healthcare crisis that we are confronting. We know that COVID-19 is a incredibly contagious virus that can present in some people as a fever, and for a household member, it could be fatal. None of us knows how our bodies are going to react to COVID-19. We know some people who are vulnerable, but every one of us could have a reaction to COVID-19. And when there's no cure and no vaccine, we've got to take aggressive action across this country. I've got on the president's radar screen early on because I observed that I thought we needed a national strategy, that this patchwork of policies from state to state, depending on who the governor is, doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because COVID-19 doesn't recognize state line, doesn't recognize party line, doesn't recognize racial lines, although it's been harder hitting our communities of color. And that's why we've got to take this incredibly seriously. So in Michigan, we've closed schools and banned public gatherings, directed restaurants to do carry-out only, and initiated what was one of the country's most aggressive stay-home orders, because we saw very quickly what COVID-19 was doing to our people. 14% of our residents are African American, and yet over 40% of COVID-19 deaths in Michigan are African Americans. This virus is holding up a mirror to our society and reminding us of the deep inequities in our country, from the lack of access to health care, to access to transportation, to lack of protections in the workplace. These inequities have hit people of color and vulnerable communities the hardest. And over the past 7 weeks, we've taken action to sign a number of executive orders to help ensure the safety and security of our most vulnerable residents. We've banned evictions and tax foreclosures. We expanded unemployment benefits and took actions to get water restored for residents. And last week, as I created the Michigan Coronavirus Task Force on Racial Disparities, I named the chair, which is my partner in state government, the Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist, who's the first African-American lieutenant governor in our state's history. Members of the task force are going to consist of leaders across state government and healthcare professionals from communities most impacted by the spread of coronavirus. And the task force is going to provide recommendations on how to address racial disparities in the moment and in the long term. We know that women of color, it's 3 times more dangerous as a woman of color simply to have a baby. And that is something that we've been working to tackle, whether it's implicit bias or access to health care. But this moment right now, we have to learn, we have to understand it, and we have to hold our leaders accountable to do better on behalf of the people of this country. It shouldn't take a global pandemic for us to address this. It shouldn't take a crisis to expand unemployment benefits. It shouldn't take a crisis to make sure that workers have protections when they're sick. It shouldn't take a crisis to ensure access to quality, affordable health care. But here we are in this crisis, seeing how important these issues are. And so this has to form, and we have to sustain an agenda that addresses all of these important factors. Now, these important decisions that we're going to make in the days ahead, in the months ahead, and the years ahead. And so I wanted to thank you for your engagement. Thank you for your thoughtful leadership. So many people on this call have communities and platforms that people listen to, and so I just encourage you to continue to stand up and do the right thing. And when leaders aren't doing right, to hold them accountable and make sure that we have phenomenal leaders that are the kind of leaders we all deserve, people who are honest, who are going to make sure that they create opportunity for every one of us, and that are going to level the playing field in the wake of what we have learned and seen very sharply here in COVID-19. We're going to get this together, but we have a lot of work ahead.
Okay. Well, Madam Governor, I talked with you a couple of weeks ago, and I'm going to go back to that conversation. I asked you the 3 things that you needed most, and I want to know if these are still the things that you needed. About 2 weeks ago, you said to me you needed testing kits were number 1, masks number 2, and number 3, ventilators. Are you still in need of those items at this date?
April, thanks for asking. We need swabs and reagents. That's to help us conduct all the tests that we can. And, we need some support out of the federal government in terms of resources. My friends and colleagues on this call will have made similar comments publicly that the response from the federal government to support the states is lacking. We need resources and the flexibility to determine how those resources are expended at the state level. Every state in the country, including our local governments like the mayors, City of Atlanta, are confronting serious issues with regard to our budgets. We've been impacted because of this economic crisis. It all stems from COVID-19. And while Mitch McConnell might suggest that we should think about going bankrupt, we know that that is not an option. And the most important thing we need right now from the federal government is help and some flexibility.
And last question to you. In the midst of all of this, you are the governor of the entire state, but we're talking about the disproportionality of how this invisible, deadly virus hits people of color, particularly Black America. I'm thinking about Detroit. I'm thinking about Flint. Could you give me the stats that you have? And am I correct in assuming that Detroit and Flint have been hit hardest?
Yes, you're correct. And one of the, I think, statistics that just really surprises people is when I tell them 14% of our population in Michigan is African American, and yet 40% of the deaths are African American. And when we see these numbers, and we're one of the first states to actually be transparent and share racial data, there is an undeniable link here. Now, do we understand every facet of that link? No. But we do know that when there's a lack of opportunity, lack of access to health care, worse outcomes because of it, they like to say comorbidities, whatever, that's, anyone who's got any sort of an ailment means that you're uniquely vulnerable. And we know that communities of color have not had the same opportunity and access, and that is feeding into this disparate outcome. And that's precisely why we need to call on every state to release this kind of data. We need to demand that while Michigan's moving forward with a task force, and I know some other states are trying to take action, that the federal government take this seriously, that we analyze every state in the nation, and that we address this in long-term policy so that we really level the playing field for people. The fact that this is playing out in real time is undeniable, and it's time for us to force the issue to be addressed in this country.
Governor Whitmer, thank you. I want to go to Abba. Abba, let's go to some audience questions right now. The first question, I believe, is for Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms.
Yes, April. So we have a question from Jessica in Georgia. Jessica, go ahead with your question.
The question that I have is with the high proportion or the high percentage of cases in the African American communities, what are we doing to help assist with the amount of testing sites? Specifically in DeKalb County in Georgia, and Mayor Bottoms, you're doing an excellent job in Fulton County, but in some of our suburban or metro areas, testing in the Black communities are very scarce. Specifically in DeKalb County, we have 4 health departments, and 3 of which are active right now. One that's in the actual Black community, where the higher number of cases are for that county, is actually been temporary closed as of March 30th, and those employees were dispersed to the other 3 locations. And I think that with the Black Americans being the ones going to having to go to work and being at a higher risk of contracting this virus, they need the more access to the testing sites, which would help them determine if they need to stay home or go to work. I think we could be a better in a better position if we have more testing sites available to African Americans in these high percentage areas where the cases are higher.
Thank you for the question, Mayor Bottoms.
So, Jessica, I couldn't agree more. We do need more testing, and I have to give the state and the governor credit for this. There have been expanded testing sites. I know specifically within the city of Atlanta, they have been in largely African American communities. And I can tell you, I'm not sure how recently you tried to get tested, but my brother called on yesterday. He was having some symptoms. They triaged him over the phone. It was pretty easy. He and my mother actually called. They told my mother she was not eligible for testing because of her symptoms, but they did allow my brother to get tested, and he had an appointment this morning. So I'm sharing that with you because if it has not been over the past few days in which you've tried, I would recommend that you try again. If you are in the city of Atlanta, DeKalb County, you can simply call 311 and get more information. But I'm sure that you can access that information for DeKalb County as well.
Abba, the next question, please, for Michigan Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist.
Yes, April, we have Yvonne in New York. Yvonne, you are on. Go ahead with your question.
Yes, my question is this. During the Democratic campaigning, primary campaigning, the concept of having a universal basic income was something that candidate Andrew Yang popularized at that time. I know he didn't originate the concept, but he was promoting it. And now that the unemployment is so extremely high, I was wondering if you felt that having a universal basic income in place as a standard practice would alleviate the need for people to be filing for unemployment insurance, because they would at least be guaranteed some kind of income in whether it's good times or bad times. They would know that they would have at least this minimum income coming in. So I'm just wondering what people think about implementing that concept as a regular practice.
Well, good evening, everyone. And Yvonne, thank you for the question. President Johnson, thank you for the forum. April, thank you for moderating all of us. And I think the short answer to your question is this pandemic has made clear that we need to have many more supports available for people. And I think that principle of a basic income was what was driving what the United States Congress did when they passed this notion of everyone getting a $1,200 stimulus check. Now, unfortunately, that was implemented poorly, and a lot of people who thought they were going to be eligible for that or thought they would have received it by now have not yet done so. But I think there is a conversation about how we need to expand the safety net in this country. Certainly in the state of Michigan, we've seen unprecedented levels of unemployment. And it's led to us needing to expand access to unemployment for more people than who've ever been eligible for it before. And we also need to think about how we can expand access to healthcare and expand access to food assistance and other forms of income support. So I think that's going to be a conversation going forward. And as we get into this now normal, as the mayor said, we need to think about how that's going to be different, why it needs to be different, and how things like universal assistance programs can be better supportive of communities of color, Black communities like in my city of Detroit, where I'm calling you from right now, how we can make sure that our people have what we need to be able to not just survive, but to thrive.
All right. And we have a question on voting for the president of the NAACP, ABBA.
We have a question from Charles in Hampton, Virginia.
My question is concerning the fact that New York has set the president, considering that they virtually canceled the primaries due to Senator Sanders exiting the race, but also concerns of the virus, and the president already making it known that they might consider canceling the elections. Do we think, is it possible that the New York has basically given Trump the green light to cancel the elections come November and using the current situation as an excuse to do so, especially if there's a second wave that comes back stronger than the one that we're currently in?
Thank you for the question. First of all, the president lacks the authority to cancel the election. It is constitutional. Therefore, there will be an election in November, the first Tuesday. Secondly, we must understand that this pandemic is actually a man-made pandemic as a result of the 2016 election. So it's going to be even more critical for the NAACP and all of the African American community to turn out to vote. When we don't participate, others define the agenda. But when we do participate, we are able to define the needs and interests of our community. But in addition to that, Amy, Senator Klobuchar talked earlier about the upcoming stimulus package. And one of the things they're going to be considering is how to manage this year's election. It is elections. State elections are something different, but with federal elections, there is a level of authority that federal legislation can require states to comply with. For us, it's not only vote by mail, but it's ensuring that we have precincts that are adequate to meet the population of a particular county, making sure that every precinct have enough voting machines, making sure election workers are equipped with the proper safeties that's important for them to be protected. So there will be an election in November. It will get carried out. This president lacks authority, but the authority of the African American community is to organize and turn out to vote in greater numbers than we've ever seen.
Thank you so much, President Johnson. And this concludes my portion. I'm going to throw it back over to the president of the NAACP. And I want to thank everyone for joining. And I want to thank the NAACP for having me for this important conversation. I grew up as a kid in Baltimore understanding that this is an organization that fights for people who look like me. And we need this organization even in times of crisis. So please give as much as you can to support this organization that is trying and working hard to support you. President Johnson, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you always, April, for supporting us and doing what you do best, bringing information to our community. And I'm going to ask everyone on the line, if you would please support the NAACP, press *8. But I am sitting in front of a kente cloth. 2019 was the 400th anniversary of the year return. And for the NAACP, we traveled over 300 people to Ghana to recognize that moment. We went to Kente Village and they made this cloth from scratch. Everything from the yarn to the dye to the everything. It also symbolized in this the power of our community. That when we really work towards a unified effort, we get outcomes that's unimaginable. 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade, we've been able to survive through that. And in the midst, we have created a culture in these states that's unmatched anywhere in the world. But we must also lean into what I call our collective consciousness. understanding that there are many people who simply will put a profit above people and lack our interests, such as the governor of Georgia. I want to thank Senator Amy Klobuchar for joining us. I want to thank the mayor of Atlanta for joining us. I want to thank Wendell Pierce for bringing a voice of history as it relates to Katrina. I want to thank Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist and Governor Whitmer and Governor Cuomo, because as African Americans, as the NAACP, we must stick together and stay together. We also want to ask you to volunteer. Elections have consequences. We would not be sitting here, in my opinion, if we would have turned out at greater numbers in 2016. This is a man-made pandemic. So if you want to help us for this upcoming election, go to naacp.org/engage and sign up as a volunteer. We need to turn out record numbers of voters. And we're going to focus on 11 states, 190 electoral votes. We're very clear, we're very targeted, but we need your support. And finally, continue to join this series. On Thursday, Ed Gordon would lead a discussion with Black males, T.I., Charlamagne the God, Mark Lamont Hill, and many others to talk about what does it mean to be a Black male in this moment. Continue to support the NAACP as we work hard to support our community, our needs, and our interests. Hit *8. It is a unique time for all of us, but in crisis, we will have the ability to remake the necessary changes so that we can meet the needs of our community. Thank you, everyone, for joining us again. We are just under 25,000 people who listened in this evening. That is a great number. For this month of Town Hall Series, we've averaged over 20,000 people each call. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Hit *8 and donate this evening. Have a good night.